March 27th, 1964, 5:36. Anchorage hums with life. In seconds, the ground convulses with the force of a magnitude 9.2 megathrust, shattering everything trusted about solid Earth. Roads twist, entire neighborhoods collapse, and in remote Chenega, Che-Nigu, a 27-foot wall of water erases almost an entire village, all before the shock has even faded. The official story: a devastating earthquake. But the hidden force that crushed Alaska was more than brute shaking. It was a chain reaction of unseen weaknesses within the earth and society itself. How did these invisible forces conspire to destroy so much, so quickly? And what did we learn that changed disaster response forever? The answers begin with the first terrifying minutes. Anchorage's west side, just minutes after the first tremor, became a landscape no engineer could have predicted. At Turnagain Heights, the ground itself seemed to dissolve. A 130-acre section slid nearly 2,000 feet toward the inlet, carrying dozens of homes, roads, and utility lines with it. The earth here wasn't just shaking, it was turning to liquid underfoot. This was Bootlegger Cove clay, a hidden weakness beneath the city. When the quake hit, water trapped in these clay layers surged upward, stripping the soil of its strength. Entire blocks lost their grip and began sliding as one, splitting streets and swallowing anything built on shallow foundations. The Turnagain slide wasn't the only collapse. In Government Hill, the elementary school split nearly in half as a translatory landslide opened a deep trench beneath the building. Downtown, 4th Avenue dropped by as much as 10 feet, leaving storefronts perched over jagged new cliffs. Anchorage's critical services, water, sewer, electricity, were severed in seconds. Gas lines snapped and sparked fires, while ruptured water mains left neighborhoods flooded and unprotected. For residents, escape routes vanished as fissures opened in the roads, sometimes wide enough to swallow cars. Survivors described the ground rolling in waves, houses tilting at impossible angles, and the sound of snapping timber mixing with the roar of shifting earth. All of this devastation traced back to the city's unseen foundation. Where engineers had once trusted shallow footings, the quake exposed the dangers of building on sensitive, saturated clay. In the aftermath, Anchorage faced not just the loss of homes and lives, but a reckoning with the very ground beneath its streets. The failures here would force a new approach to construction and planning. But for now, the city was left fractured, its infrastructure in ruins, its people cut off and waiting for help. On the southwest coast of Chenega Island, the ground had barely stopped shaking when the ocean began to behave strangely. Water drained from the harbor with alarming speed, exposing rocks and seaweed that were usually hidden beneath the surface. For longtime residents, this was a warning more urgent than any siren. Deckhand Nick Gaspy, working aboard a small Alaska Steamship Company vessel, shouted for everyone to run uphill. Nurse Mary Sarabia moved quickly, gathering children and elders, urging them away from the beach and up the steep path behind the village. Some paused, confused by the sudden emptiness of the bay. Others followed the old stories and ran without hesitation. Just 4 minutes after the earthquake, a wall of water nearly 27 feet high surged into the inlet. The wave snapped fishing boats from their moorings, crushed wooden houses, and swept the schoolhouse from its foundation. The roar was deafening, a sound survivors would later compare to a freight train tearing through the village. Mary Sarabia's group reached the safety of higher ground just in time. Nick Gaspy, too, managed to scramble up the hillside, pulling others with him. Those who hesitated or tried to gather belongings were caught in the surge. When the water receded, Chinega was almost unrecognizable. Out of 68 people, only 45 survived. 23 residents, 1/3 of the village, were lost in a matter of minutes. The force of the tsunami erased homes, family histories, and nearly an entire community. In the aftermath, stories of Mary Sarabia's determination and Nick Gaspy's warnings became part of Alaska's oral history. Chinega's tragedy and the speed with which disaster struck would haunt emergency planners for years to come. George Plafker flew into Prince William Sound just days after the shaking stopped, carrying a field notebook and a set of tide gauges. At first glance, the devastation looked random. Some stretches of shoreline were lifted high and dry above the water, while others had vanished below the tide. Plafker started measuring everything. On Montague Island, he found barnacles stranded nearly 49 feet above their old water line. A few miles away, entire forests stood drowned in salt water, their roots suddenly sunk by as much as 8 feet. These weren't isolated pockets of damage. The pattern stretched for hundreds of miles, from Hinchinbrook Island to the Trinity Islands, following the shape of the coast and the hidden edge of the Pacific Plate. Hand-drawn cross-sections filled Plafker's notebooks, each one a record of how the land had shifted. He mapped lines where the earth had buckled upward and others where it had dropped away. The evidence didn't match the old idea of shallow crustal faults. Instead, Plafker realized, the entire region had moved along a sloping plain deep beneath the surface. The Pacific Plate had shoved itself under Alaska, forcing up the coastline and pulling down the land behind it. This was a mega-thrust event, proof that the theory of plate tectonics was more than just speculation. Plafker's fieldwork overturned decades of geological thinking. His measurements showed that the force behind the disaster wasn't a single break in the earth, but the slow, unstoppable collision of two massive plates. The uplift and subsidence he documented became the gold standard for earthquake science. For the first time, engineers and planners had a map of how the ground itself could move during a subduction quake. Every cross-section, every tide mark, would help set the standard for how to build and rebuild in one of the world's most dangerous seismic zones. Anchorage's future was decided in a series of packed city meetings, where engineers, geologists, and policymakers argued over every detail of how to rebuild. The failures exposed by the earthquake left no room for shortcuts. In the summer of 1965, the city adopted a rewritten building code that set new standards for seismic safety. Deep foundations became mandatory for any structure rising in mapped hazard zones. Builders could no longer rely on shallow footings or guesswork. Every project now required a geo-technical investigation to find stable ground below the clay. Hazard maps, drawn by the Engineering and Geological Evaluation Group, carved the city into zones based on the risk of landslides, liquefaction, and ground failure. Some neighborhoods were designated off-limits for new construction. Others faced strict oversight, with building inspectors checking that piles reached solid strata and that designs could handle both horizontal and vertical ground movement. Critical facilities, hospitals, emergency centers, schools came under even tighter scrutiny. These buildings had to meet higher standards for structural redundancy and utility backup, with special attention paid to foundation depth and lateral strength. The code also introduced a municipal inspection regime requiring third-party review for large or public projects. For the first time, Anchorage's regulations reflected the realities of living on unstable ground. The lessons from Turn Again and Government Hill were written into law, ensuring that new homes and offices would not repeat the mistakes of the past. The disaster also forced a new approach to coastal safety. In the years after the quake, the West Coast and Alaska Tsunami Warning Center was established to monitor seismic activity and issue real-time alerts. Its first public drill in 1907 tested new communication protocols and siren networks, pushing the limits of what was technically possible at the time. Engineers and planners studied the failures at Chenega and Valdez, designing warning systems that could reach isolated communities with only minutes to spare. These protocols, born from the chaos of 1964, set the model for tsunami preparedness worldwide. Today, hazard maps, deep foundations, and early warning systems stand as the lasting legacy of Alaska's reckoning with the hidden force beneath its feet. At 5:36 p.m. on March 27, 1964, Alaska was struck by a magnitude 9.2 earthquake, the strongest in North American history. 4 minutes of shaking triggered massive ground failures, destroyed entire neighborhoods in Anchorage, and unleashed tsunamis that claimed 23 lives in Chenega. The disaster exposed critical weaknesses in building practices and disaster response. Fieldwork led by George Plafker confirmed subduction as the cause, reshaping global earthquake science. The 1965 Anchorage Building Code rewrite and the 1967 launch of the West Coast and Alaska Tsunami Warning Center transformed safety standards worldwide. Yet, the exact risks of future megathrust events remain difficult to predict, and some technical assessments from the period are still classified. Today, every earthquake drill and warning system bears the mark of lessons learned in 1964. The evidence is clear. Alaska's devastation forced the world to rethink how we prepare for the planet's most powerful forces.